Good evening, everyone. Sorry about the brief little delay. If you're still arriving, please find a seat. It's really wonderful to have you all with us here tonight for From Thule to MOSAiC, 75 years of French and German Arctic research. My name is Grace Dobush, and I will be moderating this evening. Before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone to turn off your phones, silence them at the very least. You're welcome to post on social media if you like. I'm proposing the hashtag Thule MOSAiC, just a combination of the two. If you'd like, let's see if it catches on. Research has shown that the impact of climate change is almost 4 times larger in the Arctic than anywhere else on Earth. This phenomenon is called Arctic amplification, but as one of our speakers tonight has told me, there's no such thing as Arctic exceptionalism. The geopolitical conflicts playing out this year are also very visible and present in the North. We will be discussing this evening in the panel discussion. We are also celebrating this evening the 100th birthday and legacy of polar explorer Jean Mallory, and we are also celebrating the French and German joint Arctic research efforts. To welcome us to this evening, I would like to welcome on stage Thomas Guibert, the first counselor of the French ambassador.
Thank you very much, dear Professor Buy, dear Professor Rex, dear Professor Borm, dear Dr. Grossfeld, dear Dr. Trefeisen, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the French ambassador, Mr. François Delattre, I would like to welcome you very warmly tonight in the French embassy for the Climatalk 2022 conference, and after 2 years of pandemic, where the Climatalk conferences had to take place virtually, it's a huge pleasure for us to have you here tonight. My name is Thomas Guibert, as it was said, and I'm the third counselor of this embassy, and I'm very, very happy to have you here and to address you a few words. So, as you know, this annual Climatalk conference aims to celebrate the anniversary of the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, and for the 2022 edition, the focus will be on Arctic science. 7 years ago today, on the 12th of December 2015, the historic Paris Agreement was concluded. 195 countries had then adopted it, and this agreement had been exceptional in more than one way, and it is important to recall the following facts. Firstly, because it is the first time because for the first time, precise and universal objectives had been established, and secondly, because a broad consensus had crossed the entire international community. The Paris Agreement constitutes a global roadmap in the pursuit of the goal of carbon neutrality and the preservation of the planet. But the road ahead is still long. To date, the effort is still insufficient to limit global warming and achieve carbon neutrality by 2050. The climate outlook is alarming. 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming will probably be reached within the next 20 years. This year, global greenhouse gas emissions will almost reach the record of 2019. More than ever, it is important to move away from fossil fuels for both climatic reasons and reasons of sovereignty and peace, as the war in Ukraine reminds us. However, efforts are important and encouraging signs can be seen with an increasing mobilization at all levels. While the political world and civil society continue their efforts for the climate, scientists continue to provide us with increasingly precise expertise on the state of our planet. The observation of the marine environment is at the core of this expertise, and one of the most worrisome changes is happening in the Arctic, where temperatures are increasing 4 times faster than in the rest of the world. In this region, warming is not only threatening local population, it could also have global impacts. This is the reason why we chose to place the Arctic at the heart of tonight's event. So this event will include a discussion of the MOSAiC expedition, the largest ever Arctic expedition led by the Alfred Wegener Institute for Polar and Marine Research in Bremerhaven. I would like to take this opportunity to say the importance of international scientific cooperation in the success of these major expeditions. Researchers of 17 different nationalities, including from France and Germany, have contributed to the success of MOSAiC. We are very thankful to have among us Professor Rex, the leader of the expedition, who will speak about it in a few minutes. This conference is also an opportunity for us to pay tribute to the research of Jean Mallory, a French pioneer in Arctic research, born in Germany, by the way, in Mainz, and who will turn 100 in 10 days exactly, and who is particularly known for his legendary expedition to Thule during the winter of 1950-1951, as well as for his involvement in the defense of local minorities. French researchers have been present in the Arctic region of Spitsbergen since 1963 with the Charles Rabot base. They were joined by German researchers in 1988. In addition to numerous joint research projects, a bilateral cooperation agreement between the Paul-Émile Victor Institute and the Alfred Wegener Institute allows France and Germany to share a common base in Spitsbergen, the Avipev base. Each year, this station hosts around 130 to 150 scientists from Germany and France. For the years to come, ocean research and the protection of marine ecosystems remain a priority for France. Thus, on the 7th of November, during the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, the French President Macron took a position in favor of banning all exploitation of the deep sea. Earlier this year, he and the President of the Republic of Costa Rica, Rodrigo Chavez Robles, announced their intention to organize together the third United Nations Conference on the Oceans, which will take place in 2025. But for now, I would like to thank all the speakers for presenting their research and discussing with us this evening. I wish you all a very pleasant evening, and now I give the floor back to Mrs. Dokush. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next, a word from Professor Alain Bouy, President of UVSQ, an associated member of University Paris-Saclay, and he will be speaking in French with a translation in English to be displayed.
So thank you. Due to the fact that we are in the French embassy, so I will speak in French, but you will have the translation on the slideshow. So, Monsieur le Premier Conseiller, Mesdames, Messieurs, je suis très heureux d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui et d'avoir été invité pour prononcer quelques mots. Ah, the slideshow is not here, so you have it in English. Je suis très heureux d'être parmi vous aujourd'hui et d'avoir été invité à prononcer quelques mots en ouverture de cette soirée consacrée à un domaine de recherche scientifique très cher à l'Université de Versailles-Saint-Quentin en Yvelines que je préside. Je vous remercie donc sincèrement, Monsieur le Premier Conseiller, au nom de Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, pour cette invitation. Ce sont donc des recherches sur l'Arctique qui sont à l'honneur et au cœur des discussions de ce soir. Comme je le mentionnais, il s'agit d'un sujet au cœur des activités de l'Université de Versailles. Les études arctiques sont en effet une des thématiques majeures de formation et de recherche dans notre université, qui au fil des années a développé, si je peux me permettre de le dire, une véritable expertise sur le sujet. Plus précisément, les études arctiques de l'UVSQ, c'est l'acronyme de l'Université de Versailles, est un réseau unique dans le paysage universitaire français avec plus de 80 enseignants-chercheurs et chercheurs qui ont comme objet d'étude l'Arctique, abordé par différents angles d'approche, que ce soit dans une perspective pluridisciplinaire. Nous avons ainsi dans notre université des enseignants-chercheurs et chercheurs en sciences humaines, comme par exemple en anthropologie, en histoire, en littérature, mais également en sciences du climat et de l'environnement, membres de différents laboratoires de recherche. Notre université est également fortement impliquée dans les études arctiques à l'échelle internationale. L'université est ainsi l'un des rares membres ne faisant pas partie de la zone polaire et, je crois, le premier membre universitaire du réseau U-Arctic, et un réseau qui est un réseau, vous le savez, international de plus de 200 universités, instituts de recherche et institutions dédiées à la formation et à la recherche sur les thématiques arctiques. Par ailleurs, et je me permets de l'évoquer car nous sommes ici à Berlin, notre université a également inauguré l'an dernier une école doctorale franco-allemande sur les études arctiques, Perceiving Arctic Change, en collaboration avec l'Institut Alfred Wegener et l'Université franco-allemande. À travers ce bref exposé, je ne cherche en aucun cas à vanter ou valoriser outre mesure les mérites de l'Université de Versailles Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines, mais simplement à présenter en quoi une université et ses personnels, ses enseignants-chercheurs tentent au quotidien, à travers leurs travaux, de contribuer à la réflexion scientifique globale sur une région du monde certes distante pour nous, Français, mais néanmoins névralgique au cœur des enjeux contemporains, notamment ceux liés au réchauffement climatique, comme nous aurons, et vous l'avez dit, Monsieur le Premier conseiller, l'occasion de le comprendre plus en détail par l'intervention du professeur Marcus Rex au sujet de l'exposition MOSAiC et que je me réjouis d'écouter. Mais parler des études arctiques, c'est également s'inscrire dans la continuité des premiers scientifiques ayant ouvert la voie de ce champ d'études. Car évoquer les recherches scientifiques sur l'Arctique, c'est bien évidemment évoquer la figure tutélaire de Jean Mallory, mise à l'honneur ce soir. Le professeur Jan Born, qui prendra la parole dans quelques minutes, saura vous présenter bien mieux que moi le parcours, les travaux de recherche et les apports de ce très grand scientifique, spécialiste incontesté des études arctiques, à la carrière exceptionnelle, internationalement reconnue, qu'est le professeur Jean Mallory. De mon point de vue, je peux toutefois vous dire en quoi le professeur Jean Mallory a grandement apporté à notre université et à travers elle au monde universitaire français et bien plus largement. Car vous ne le savez peut-être pas, mais l'université de Versailles a noué depuis plusieurs années des liens très étroits avec Jean Mallory et ses travaux. C'est ainsi en collaboration avec Jean Mallory qu'a été créé au sein de notre université en 2009 un premier laboratoire consacré aux études arctiques. Il s'appelle le MOSAiC. Puis en 2010, toujours avec l'appui de Jean Mallory, un master degree unique en France, le Master Arctic Studies, qui accueille un large public et notamment des étudiants internationaux et qui permet, dans une logique pluridisciplinaire, de former aux différents enjeux de l'Arctique. Et fort de ces liens qui unissent notre université à Jean Mallory, nous avons également récemment créé un nouveau laboratoire de recherche. Il s'appelle l'Institut de recherche arctique Jean Mallory, qui a pour vocation d'animer les recherches autour et dans la continuité de son œuvre. La création de cette nouvelle structure de recherche matérialise ainsi l'importance que nous accordons à la nécessité de faire vivre et de poursuivre son immense travail scientifique. Par ailleurs, le rôle de cet institut sera également de coordonner la valorisation scientifique de la collection personnelle d'objets, carnets et archives personnelles de Jean Mallory, qui a fait l'objet d'une donation à l'Institut océanographique de Monaco. À travers cette soirée, je souhaite donc rendre un hommage appuyé au professeur Jean Mallory, immense chercheur français, pionnier dans les domaines des études arctiques, à qui la communauté scientifique française et internationale doit tant. Et je suis ravi que l'événement de ce soir soit l'occasion de revenir sur sa carrière et ses travaux, et au-delà d'évoquer la richesse et l'évolution des recherches sur l'Arctique depuis la première expédition du professeur Mallory, vous l'aviez rappelé, monsieur le Premier conseiller, à l'hiver 50-51. Plus largement et en conclusion, je suis donc très heureux que cette soirée soit l'occasion de mettre à l'honneur un champ de recherche scientifique majeur à nos yeux, un champ de recherche transdisciplinaire qui concerne une région du monde au cœur d'un grand nombre d'enjeux contemporains, qu'il s'agisse d'enjeux géopolitiques ou de questions environnementales et climatiques. J'espère et je ne doute pas que cette soirée sera riche d'échanges et de réflexions. Thank you very much.
Professor Antje Boetius, director of the Alfred Wegener Institute, can't be with us in person today, but she has sent us a video message.
Dear Ambassador François Delattre, dear Mr. President, Professor Bouy, dear Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, chers amis. I would like to welcome you all to this special event and convey my best wishes for the evening. I sincerely thank you for inviting us to hold this joint event at the French Embassy. The 100th of Jean Mallory's birth is an outstanding occasion to honor and celebrate French-German cooperation, especially in the context of joint polar research. Names like his, or also of the namesake of our institute, Alfred Wegener, they make us dream and make us aware of the ultimate mission of humanity, to explore, understand, and protect the planet we inhabit. My warmest congratulations go to Jean Mallory himself, who devoted himself in particular to connect our knowledge system to that of First Nations indigenous people. I was able to look at some of his materials in Monaco before the opening of the beautiful polar exhibition there. Mallory's life and work have always been dedicated to the protection of Arctic people and their achievements. Together with the French polar explorer and writer Paul-Émile Victor, he undertook 2 Greenland expeditions in 1948 and 1949, and these are really famous still today. 20 years ago, we founded the German-French Collaboration and Research Station AVIPEF on Svalbard. We hope to celebrate also this anniversary next year to illustrate the close and very good cooperation between the 2 nations. Arctic and polar research are only possible in international cooperation, which we experienced very impressively 2 years ago during the unique polar expedition MOSAiC here at the North Pole. More than 20 nations invested into that mission to investigate and decipher causes and effects of climate change in the Arctic, but also the still many unknown and elementary processes in the interaction of the climate system. Over 400 people from 70 institutes participated in the giant task to assess the role of the polar night, the Arctic winter, in climate and biodiversity. The results are the basis for better projections of a rapidly changing climate that affects our lives in all parts of the world. 7 years ago today, the Paris Climate Agreement was signed in Paris, with which the global community set out to limit climate change to a level that can still be controlled. We all use these results together, and we work together, especially with France, to design forthcoming expeditions, such as the Tara Drift Station, but also a big international mission around Antarctica. Jean Mallory led important foundations for European cooperation in the Arctic more than 75 years ago. And it is our task today to continue this cooperation and the efforts to protect the Arctic, the people living there, and the entire world that is connected. I'm also very pleased that we have a very long and intensive cooperation with the University of Versailles, which is also a co-organizer today, and that through the joint project Gateway to the Arctic, we are making an important contribution to successfully promoting work across the boundaries of different disciplines. I wish you all an insightful and fun evening, and once again congratulate Jean Mallory on such a special birthday. All the best and an interesting event to you all.
So we'll now dive into the two main presentations of the evening, each of which will have a few minutes for questions at the end. So if Jan Boom would like to come to the stage. He is a professor in British literature at UVSQ, where he also co-directs the transdisciplinary Masters II program in Arctic Studies affiliated with the Excellence Cluster University of Paris-Saclay. Jan, welcome.
Okay, dear ladies and gentlemen, meine Damen und Herren, it's a great pleasure and honor to talk about Jean Mallory, who you can see on this photograph here, which is probably the most iconic photograph we have of him as he was returning from far up north, Inglefield Land and Washington Land in Greenland in 1951. So From Stones to Soul is an allusion to his latest work, which you will see in a few minutes, which has just come out. He finished writing it this year, as has been said several times. He's just about to celebrate his 100th birthday. He's alive and kicking, as they say in English, living in his home in Dieppe, and he's going to have a birthday party just before Christmas. And that's incidentally why he's called Jean Noël, because he was born just before Christmas. So if I may, whoops, sorry, I need to go back. We can have the first slide. There we are. So I'm going to show you a number of slides with photographs. I think it's more lively, and then we'll just comment as we go along. So I don't know if any of you are so good at reading old German handwriting. So here's his birth certificate from 1922. He was born in Mainz because his father was a history teacher at the Lycée Français in Mainz, or Mayence, as we say in French. Maybe some of you don't know, but Rhineland was administered by France at this time from 1922 until 1930, when the family left. And so Mallory was exposed to German culture and Nordic fog, as it were, for French people. The northern spirit is the spirit of fog. And so he often talks about that. And it's true, when he writes, he has very long sentences, which is an un-French thing to do. And he tends to place the adjectives in front of the nouns, which he can do in exceptional moments in French, but not all the time. And he does it almost systematically. So I think there's some kind of influence there. He often talks about it himself and says that he listened to German fairy tales from his nurse as a young boy. So there was a celebration in early 20th century in Mainz, and this is the sign you can find on the door on the house where he was living, Mathildestraße, and there you have the former mayor of the city of Mainz. It was a wonderful welcome for him, and up there you can see him in all his glory, having come back from his trip up north in Greenland. So a few words about his early career. So during the war, he was sent to a classe prépa. French people know what this means. It's a kind of very long entrance exam to get into the most prestigious schools. And he said, in retrospect, he was shocked by the teaching that he received there in philosophy, because all they would talk about would be Kant and Hegel and all the German names, but nothing about Buddhism, nothing about Taoism and other religions, as though there's nothing else in the world, So he was hesitant about that. And then in 43, he was called to join the mandatory workforce imposed by the German occupants in France to the people of his generation, and he just simply refused to do it. So he had to go into hiding, which meant also that he had to cut ties with his family, which is obviously a very difficult thing to do. So he joined the Resistance, and then from the summer 44, he was able to pick up his studies again. He studied geography at the University of Paris, under a very famous geographer called Emmanuel de Martonne, who had the very good idea to tell him there's more to life than the agrégation, and getting into one of those prestigious schools. So why don't you join this polar expedition, the French polar expedition going up north? I think that's exactly the right thing for you to do. So it was on recommendation of de Martonne that he joined this expedition led by Paul-Émile Victor, who is the person that was chosen for the French Polar Institute. Right? So he did 2 campaigns with him, but he is a bit of a solitary loner person, and he said he wanted to be on his own very quickly, and then he received an order to do, he was invited to do some work in Algeria, in the Hoggar Desert, and then up north, because what he was interested in was scree, you say in English, fallen rock. So he became what he calls in French un ébulologue. If you speak German, we would say ein Geröllologe. That's what he became. He was interested in the dynamics of fallen rock and what happens inside the stones exposed to the weather in extreme conditions, hot and cold. So first he did a comparison, then he got fed up with the hot weather and decided to work in the cold. And he has a kind of childhood memory walking across the Rhine River entirely frozen over in 1929 with his father, and that north, of course. So that was pointing the way as it were. Well, anyway, he decided to focus only on the Arctic after that. So here is the leave taking of the annual ship, which went to Thule in 1950. When he reached Thule in the summer of 1950, at this time, nobody was allowed to go to Greenland unless he had authorization from the Danish government, and Thule was extremely difficult to get to. He was given authorization. I'll spare you the details on how he managed to get that, but he did. And this is the group of polar Eskimos, as they're known in history, waving goodbye to the boat. So here is a few slides about his scientific achievements. So I will give you 1 or 2 takeaway messages at the end, but he is the special thing about his scientific career is that he's a trained geomorphologist, but also well known as an anthropologist, and that is quite rare. You know? So, which has led to him being extremely skeptical about anthropology, because he said it's not exact. You know? And he always looks at it from the scientist's point of view, if you wish. So he was able to go on the raid up to Washington Land with 2 Inuit couples. Now that is unheard of, I think, at this time. That you have Inuit companions is a normal thing to happen, but that they took their wives along is very exceptional. And he said the ladies were taking a great interest in what they were doing up there, and so they were a group of 5 going up there with no material with them. They were depending on hunting like Rasmussen before them. So it was quite a risky business, and the idea was to do maps. So he drew maps, and he was authorized by the Danish government to give up to 10 names to places in Greenland, and he insisted on giving some indigenous names for the first time to some places, but also to pay homage to, well, Paris. You can't see it on the slide here maybe very well, but there's an area called Paris Fjord, and he has also a fjord. He named the fjord De Martonne Fjord, you know, like any good student should do when they're thinking about their master. So anyway, here he is at this time, and here you can see on the right-hand side his thesis, which was published much later. I come to the next slide, and an important point. So when he arrived in Thule, he was on his own, and he was not very useful to the Inuit because he didn't know how to ride a dog sledge or to do anything that people do over there. And so he didn't write about it so much previously, but in his new book, he has a long, long passage, which you can read in translation in the new Lettres Internationales, if you want to look at that. A passage called Neugeboren, after 2 months of depression or being inside a black hole, as he called it himself, and pulling himself out like Munchausen, you know. Out of this, he decided, I will do something crazy. I will take the dog sledge and just go for it. And he said, the Inuit said, okay, maybe we'll see him again, maybe not, you know, c'est la vie. Let's see what happens. And then they thought he was a bit nuts, you know. And so he did it, and he somehow managed to survive. And that's what he tells over 20 pages in absolutely fascinating style. So if you're interested, please have a look at the new lettre. So there he is saying, thank you to his dogs. And this is important because what happened in his career was he was there to do his scientific work, but when he returned with his companions to Thule, he realized that the Americans had just opened the American air base in Thule. And he was so shocked about this because it meant a forced dislocation of the local group that he decided to write about it to defend their interests. So he stopped his PhD, which is a very bad thing to do, as you know, when you're a scientist. The CNRS was not happy about it, no more money. He said, I don't mind, I'm going to write this book to testify to what happened to them. So he wrote The Last Kings of Thule, Die letzten Könige von Thule in German translation, with an introduction by Georgi. We talked about Wegener. If you know Wegener, you know also Georgi. And this has become the most widely distributed book in the world about Greenland, with over 20 translations and more than 1 million copies sold. So it's absolutely amazing. And that's one first takeaway message from today. If you want to remember Jean Mallory, he's best known for this book. Please note also the fact that he decided to put his companion on the cover and not himself, like explorers often do. He wanted to have an indigenous face on the cover because they're the real kings. It's them, not me. All right. So Thule plays, of course, a kind of central role in his life, and he's always come back on that. There is his French hut in Sierra Paluk with a French flag, and he describes how he was trying to learn the language of the Greenlanders, putting words up on clothes pegs every day and trying to learn them by heart, and Inuit being extremely polite and trying to imitate his French accent when he was speaking Greenlandic so that he would feel comfortable, And then he said, how can I be useful to them? And so he decided to help them do their own demography because they had issues with marriages between them. This is a group of 350 people, and you need to be very well informed about family ties, not to get it wrong, as it were. So he interviewed together with his companion Kutsikitsok all 300 people, and then later on had it checked again by a specialist, and they ended up drawing this fantastic map to tell people who they were allowed to get intimate with, as it were, and who not. So here you have his notebook and a telegram he sent to his wife. Everything's fine, my dear. That kind of. So he then, in the same year, 1955, Last Kings of Thule was his the first book of a very famous book series in France called Terre Humaine, which has been described as a national treasure. There was a celebration in 2005, 50 years of Terre Humaine. So he founded this series as a book series of life stories, we call it in the US, like testimonies, but from people from all walks of life. That was important for him. Not only famous scientists like Claude Lévi-Strauss, who published the second book in the book series, Triste Tropique, which is one of the most influential books in the world after 1950, one of the earliest powerful voices questioning what the West has been doing in the former colonies. And so, because when you look at it, the tropics, all that you can see is sad, hence the title Triste Tropique. And it starts off with a famous sentence, I hate travel and explorers. And Mallory said, I got him to write that sentence because I said, what do you want to do in this book? He said, well, I don't like travel. I don't like the travel accounts. And he said, well, so say it, And that's what he did. Of course, Lévi-Strauss was already a famous person at this time, and it was a big privilege for him to be published. To accept to publish in this series. So the other book is a very famous book in France, The Horse of Pride. It's about Breton culture at a moment when people in France were not proud to talk about Breton culture openly, and it got a lot of people interested again in their own roots and speaking openly about their stories from the past and so on and so forth. So here you have the celebration at the Élysée Palace in 2005 with Jacques Chirac, who was a great fan of Mallory and Terre Humaine. And the anecdote is that Mallory said, okay, who shall we invite, Mr. President? He said, well, all the authors. He said, oh, all of them? Yes, of course, all of them. You mean absolutely every single one? Well, all of those who can still come, those who are alive. Okay, all right. And then because he published A Bank Robber. And so we were in the Élysée, and we were all lined up there. I was invited to the event, and then the president was introduced to all the authors. And then he said, je vous présente Monsieur Claude Lucas, bank robber. The president said, enchanté, monsieur. Of course, Claude Lucas has become a very well-known writer since then, so but it is to show how Mallory said, if you want to get a full picture of life and humanity, you need to have all voices, not just those which are very strong and which find it easy to talk. So there we are with his book collection. Here you have a number of his distinctions. So he's been very much involved in defending the interests of indigenous people. There's one person here in front who we will be seeing, who remembers that he organized some of the first circumpolar meetings of indigenous people through conferences in France, which were then published. So these are, historic stepping stone milestones towards a better organization of circumpolar voices, and his work has been recognized. We're going to celebrate the 20 years of the Franco-German station next year. So he was actually in charge of the French station for a number of years. One or two more things about his career. There are too many titles, it would be tedious to read them out, but the very special thing is he was appointed professor in 1957 to the very prestigious École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales without having done his PhD. because he was supported by Professor Lucien Febvre, who was one of the best-known French historians and who thought that his work on Greenland is absolutely spectacular and exactly the sort of thing that historians need to open their view, their perspective. So Febvre died in 56, and his word was so strong that they kept word and they elected him in 57, even though Febvre was not around. So that is really very remarkable. And then later on, he picked up his PhD again and he published it. And you have a very distinguished career, and we have an homage here by an artist from Alaska to Jean Mallory with the French colors, as you can see, because Rebecca Lyon thought he has been doing extraordinary work for indigenous people, so he merits to have this homage, and so we decided to take it as our logo for the Institute. So here we are reaching the latest years, so he has been in close contact with the Prince of Monaco, Albert II. They are together in Greenland here. And it was decided last year, he decided to donate his Arctic collections, notebooks, photographs, and so on and so forth to the Institute of Oceanography in Monaco. So the president of AVI already mentioned the wonderful exhibition going on there right now, Mission Polaire. You can indeed see objects from his collection there. And he has been doing pastels in the past few years. And when you come and see him, he always shows you his pastels. And it's extraordinary. You see this person who's nearly 100 years old and said, oh, you know, this is the Inuit, how I see the Inuit afterlife. You know, their spirits up there. He gets involved. So absolutely fascinating. And here is the book which came out this year. So you can read a quote. I put also one of his books in German. He has written a fascinating story of all the people who preceded him in Thule, Northwest Greenland, before he came there. And there's also a wonderful book of his photographs in German. It's called Der Ruf des Nordens, which you can actually get for very cheap now in secondhand, if you're interested. So I've reached the end. There is an exhibition coming up. And thank you very much for listening. We had a nice moment earlier this year. This is Jean Mallory at 99. Thank you. Okay, any questions? Yes, please feel free. Rasmus, yes.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was very, very interesting and fascinating. My name is Rasmus Bertelsen. I'll be on a panel later, and I'm a Danish national. So I'm just curious, what was the reaction of the Danish government to his work? Because, of course, Thule is so incredibly contentious in Danish foreign and security relations with the United States. Thank you.
I think we need a whole evening to explain that. And they're tricky, but he's always maintained, of course, formal relations with the Danish authorities. And anyway, in 1950, there was no way of going there without having their authorization. And after his criticism, I mean, there are also voices in Denmark which were critical about what was going on. Especially there was an accident in 1967, I believe it was, with the B-52. And so he, of course, protested about that also. Interesting enough, his letter was not published by Le Monde. At the time, they thought it's a bit too Le Monde. They thought it's too hot a topic, you know. So, but he has been continuously protesting, and I've heard him say it also to politicians in later life. He received the Dannebrog, which is, of course, a total sign of recognition from the authorities. So he's well respected. All his books are translated in Danish, and he returned to Thule several times afterwards for the demographic studies to check up on the facts. You know, so he continued to have a permit to go, as it were. He's critical, but very respectful at the same time. So. I think that's how he's been operating. And I didn't talk much about his connections with Soviet Union and Russia. He was invited to Leningrad from 1957 already, and has been going regularly, and founded with Jacques Chirac in the early 90s an academy to train young indigenous students in St. Petersburg. He was the first Western scientist to be allowed to go to Chukotka after 1990 on a very big expedition. So he has always been in contact with authorities and very good at making them hear what they should be hearing, but also continuing his work. Thank you.
Yes. If there are no other questions, Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I'd like to welcome to the stage next Markus Rex, professor at Potsdam University and head of atmospheric physics at the Alfred Wegener Institute. And from 2019 to 2020, he led the international research expedition MOSAiC, which we are about to hear about. Markus, welcome.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. We are talking about the Arctic tonight. That's fantastic because I love the Arctic. We are also talking about international collaboration. And as a prime example of international collaboration on Arctic research, I want to talk specifically about the MOSAiC expedition. I want to take you along on a journey to the Arctic region, to the epicenter of climate change. It's going to be a journey into a fascinating environment, which is also a dwindling world, which is disappearing because the Arctic is warming much faster as the rest of the planet. And the Arctic ice that you can see here on this beautiful picture from the central Arctic sea ice region in summer, when there is daylight so that you can see it, this Arctic ice is probably going to disappear in summer in the next few decades, and then this world will no longer exist. What you see here is a simple representation of the warming of our planet in different regions. And in such a simple picture, you immediately notice that the Arctic is standing out. It's warming much faster than the rest of the planet. All the colors here, yellow and orange, that's all warming. So pretty much every part of the globe is warming, with exceptions, some exceptions here in the Antarctic. Don't want to talk about that tonight, although it's interesting. But the Arctic up here still stands out as a region of the planet where the warming is much more pronounced than in any other part of the world. And for a long time, we thought the Arctic is warming 2 to 3 times faster than the rest of the planet. We now know that it's actually closer to 4 times faster than in the rest of the world. And that means it's also faster than our climate models can reproduce or predict. And that in itself is an indication of how limited our understanding of the climate processes in the Arctic still is, still nowadays. And to improve that, 20 nations, 90 institutions came together, worked together on one international big collaboration to improve our understanding of the Arctic climate processes in the Central Arctic sea ice region. And to make a year-long expedition in that area possible, you need not only one icebreaker, which can travel with the ice through the Arctic. You need a fleet of icebreakers and research vessels to support the operations of that flagship, which happened to be the German Polarstern, which was supported by 6 further icebreakers and research vessels in its operation in the Central Arctic. 450 people have been on the expedition in 5 different phases from 37 different nationalities. That is an impressive international collaboration, and I think it shows what can be reached if we work together, all countries of the world, in exploring those remote areas as the Arctic is. And we were all united by the one mission to explore the climate processes of the Arctic, of the Central Arctic year-round. It has been the largest Arctic expedition in any parameters that you can quantify, and it has been the first time we have brought a modern, fully equipped research icebreaker year-round, including the winter season, to the Central Arctic. And how do we do that? The Central Arctic Ocean is covered by thick ice year-round. In winter, the ice, which is shown here, that is the ice extent in winter, is so thick that we can't break it, even with our best research icebreakers. And we were always locked out of that area. This is the white area you see here is the no-go area for winter sea-going expeditions with the big icebreakers. But the fantastic pioneer of polar research, Fridtjof Nansen, a great Norwegian, has shown us to get to that region even in winter. He discovered the ice drift, which you can see here by the gray arrows, an overall drift of the Arctic sea ice from the Siberian side of the Arctic across the North Pole, which is marked by the black cross in the middle of the plot, to the water between Greenland and Svalbard, which we now call the Fram Strait. Which is named after the name of his expedition vessel, the Fram, a sailing boat, which he designed together with one of the shipbuilders of his time to survive the huge pressure that can build up in the ice. And therefore, he was the first one to cross the central Arctic during winter, going for 3 years here. Since the Nansen expedition here with the Fram, there were a few activities, year-round activities in the Central Arctic, including winter. This is the drift track of Nansen's Fram from the Siberian side into the Fram Strait here. Then we had many Soviet and Russian drift stations, little stations built on the ice, wooden huts that drifted with the ice to take very simple measurements, but over decades, from actually starting in 1937 going to 2015. Then we had the drift of the Shiba expedition here in the Beaufort Sea, not really in the Central Arctic sea ice drift, but still a year-round expedition in the Beaufort Sea area. And of course, the famous drift of the French sailing boat Tara along the red track here, a little sailing boat which provided key data from the Central Arctic, but not on a scale that we can do with a modern fully equipped research icebreaker, but still a very valuable and still famous and long-standing contribution to Central Arctic exploration. And this concept of an expedition to go with the ice throughout the winter rather than fighting against the ice was also the basic concept of the MOSAiC expedition. So in September 2019, we left Tromsø, here a port in northern Norway. We went through the Barents Sea, the Kara Sea, completely open, free of ice. The ice edge during that time is indicated by the 2 different shades of blue here. We first hit the sea ice on the eastern side of the Semeljas, and then reached our target area where we wanted to let the vessel freeze into the ice. That is marked by the red dot here. And the very rough drift track that we had foreseen for the expedition is marked by the greenish arrow, but nobody knows how the drift during an individual year will go. So nobody is able to tell where exactly such an expedition will take place. We reached that point where we shut off the engines and just started to let the vessel freeze into the ice on the 4th of October. And on the 4th of October was also the last day when we could see the sun above the horizon. Then we had the last and final sunset before the onset of polar night. And when we explored our new home for the next year, beautiful ice flow, really fantastic ice formations here on the ice. The light gets dimmer and dimmer every day. It gets more colorful every day while the sun is now setting further and further behind the horizon. And at some point, there is hardly any light left. Here you can still see some twilight and the moon. And then the long and completely dark polar night starts. For 5 months, it's completely dark without any daylight or twilight left. Now the expedition really is in the hand of nature. The drift follows the natural movement of the ice, which is driven by wind and currents. The next humans are more than 1,000 kilometers away. That's beyond the range of even the biggest helicopters, long-distance helicopters. So we now have to deal with everything with things we have on board. There's no possibilities to bring in help from outside or to evacuate people here from board. It's a very special feeling to sit there in the ice and to just know now nature is determining where we will go, and nobody really can tell where we'll be the next days, weeks or months. We have used the time. We have set up our research equipment on the ice. Most of the research really took place on the ice, not on the research vessel. We have set up a central observatory, a little city of research neighborhoods for the different disciplines, Med City, Ocean City, for all the different scientific disciplines we had on board, many more. We have brought 100 tons of scientific equipment to the ice, several kilometers of thick power lines. We have installed 70 kilowatts electrical power on the ice. And that was our central observatory, the research city that was set up next to Polarstern, up to 1 or 2 kilometers away from the vessel. That was surrounded by a network of about 50 additional stations, up to 50 kilometers away from Polarstern, which we have some of them visited throughout the winter with our helicopters to keep the autonomous instruments, which were set up in these remote stations, alive and running during the winter, and to fix all the damage that the polar bears kept doing to the instruments set up on the ice out there. So the darkness is obviously one of the challenges. It's amazing to encounter the polar night in the central Arctic, where there is no artificial light source in the vicinity whatsoever. It's completely dark, much darker than any night in our latitudes. It's pitch black. It's a brilliant black, and a brilliant contrast between the white in the foreground, the white ice formations, and the black in the background. It's fascinating to be out on the ice during these conditions. You only have this bubble of light from your own flashlight which you carry with you, and this is the world which you carry around with you on the ice. It's an experience I think everybody who has been on the expedition will always remember. The working conditions are harsh. It's not easy to work year-round, and particularly in winter on the Central Arctic sea ice. It's certainly not the coldest area of our planet. Antarctica or Central Siberia is getting much, much colder than the Central Arctic, but still, it's pretty chilly. Temperatures fall below 42 degrees Celsius here, with some wind that feels like minus 65 degrees Celsius or even a little lower. And that means frostbites will occur within seconds on any skin that is exposed to the cold air. It's a challenge to work safely there on the ice, but nowadays we have the equipment to do that. I'm still amazed how the team of Fridtjof Nansen and the early explorers could work during those conditions. And we have seen that the temperatures during winter were always continuously 10 degrees Celsius higher than the temperatures Fridtjof Nansen has encountered. He reports temperatures below minus 50 degrees Celsius frequently during this his expedition, and that is just an indication of the climate change that took place between his expedition 130 years ago and ours. Obviously, research takes place in the habitat of the polar bear. The polar bears are fascinating animals. It's fantastic to see them in their natural habitat. They are big animals, 3 meters long, half a ton. They weigh half a ton, and they still move like cats very elegantly. They move across the ice surface, and they also hunt like cats. And unfortunately, polar bears do see humans as just prey, potential prey. They are living in a very harsh environment, and they try to make use of every prey and source of food they can get, and therefore a very comprehensive polar bear safety concept is a very important element of any work on the Arctic sea ice here. Here you see some of the bears, and this is one element of our comprehensive polar bear safety concept, our last line of defense, the polar bear guard, which is always with any group working on the ice, staring into the darkness of the polar night and trying to see whether a polar bear is trying to sneak into the research camp. And they really sneak in like cats. It's quite a challenge to make sure everybody is safe on the ice. But no polar bear and no human was hurt during the expedition, and I think I take that as one of the big successes of MOSAiC. We have worked through very intense and fierce storms on the ice. Scientifically, these are extremely valuable event because we wanted to understand how storms affect the polar climate system and affect the system between the ocean, the sea ice, the snow, and the atmosphere above. But storms make it difficult to work on the ice. The drifting snow massively affects visibility and makes work on the ice extremely hard. It also affects polar bear safety because at some point you can't see whether a polar bear is approaching. But still, as long as it was at all possible, we were working on the ice during those storms. Storms move the ice, huge pressures can build up in the ice, and then these heavy ice blocks, they just move on top of each other when the ice can't withstand the pressure. Very dynamic and very energetic events, and they threaten our instruments which we have set up on the ice, and those events kept us busy, always rescuing our power lines. You see one of the power lines is just eaten up by one of the pressure ridges here. All our instruments, one is hidden below this part, and we are trying to get it out here. Also, we get cracks in the ice from wind drift, which are hidden by drifting snow. This is just a makeshift bridge we've built across one of these cracks. It's always challenging to work safely under these conditions on the ice, but also a great experience. But even the longest polar night is over at some point, and polar day sets in. The sun rises. It's one of the major events in the Arctic, when for the first time you can see the sun again, and then the sun burns down on the ice surface 24 hours a day. And it climbs higher and higher every day in the sky. And at some point, the big melting, the great melt of the Arctic ice kicks in. And the ice surface then is covered by these melt ponds here, beautiful bluish and greenish ponds on the ice. Over time, 50 to 70% of the ice surface are made of these melt ponds. And they make work on the ice difficult again. It's now an explosion of colors. You can see everything. Temperatures are much higher, around 0 degrees, so work is easy. But on the other hand, now we had to build lots of bridges to cross the landscape of open water and little pieces of ice and get safely to our instruments. But we had a wonderful time here in summer on the ice again. And lots of polar bear visits during that time. We had many weeks in a row where we had daily polar bear visits and over 60 bear visits throughout the year of the expedition altogether. We have drifted pretty much in our drift corridor, which we wanted to follow. And at the end of July 2020, we have reached the ice edge here in the Fram Strait. Pretty much at the same position where Fridtjof Nansen has reached the ice edge. And at the ice edge here, the ice flows, including the flow where our camp was set up on, they break under the influence of the swell and the waves, and that breaking of the ice is not a slow event. It's pretty sudden. So on the 30th of July, we had the first cracks appearing right through the middle of our flow. And this is what was left from our ice flow a day later on the 31st of July. And these little pieces of ice now drift out into the Atlantic and they melt out there. And that is the end of the natural life cycle of an Arctic ice flow. But we are not finished at this point. We wanted to study the freeze of the ice in the late summer and the transition into winter again, the freezing season, when the great melt of the summer transitions into the freezing of the winter. And therefore, we took off from our position where our initial flow was destroyed, and we went deep back into the ice to the North Pole. For that, we took a very unusual route north of Greenland, where we typically have the thickest and oldest ice of the Arctic. Not so in 2020. On that travel to the North Pole, we have seen huge stretches of open water, sometimes up to the horizon. The ice has not given us any resistance. Within 6 days, at the maximum travel speed of Polarstern, we just sailed through to the North Pole and reached the North Pole 6 days later from the ice edge. Quite depressing to see how fast the ice is disappearing. Even at the North Pole itself, we had huge stretches of open water and the ice was completely eroded by these melt ponds. There we have set up a new camp on a new ice flow, went into another drift phase for the second half of summer now. And when we arrived there, this is Polarstern, this is our MOSAiC flow 2.0, it was completely covered by melt ponds, as everything else in the area there in the Central Arctic. As you can see, more than half of the surface of the ice is now covered with melt ponds. But from day to day, the sun goes deeper and closer to the horizon. This is a few days earlier. This picture is a few days later here. The sun now, we are right at the North Pole, goes parallel to the horizon around us, but every day a little deeper. On the opposite side, you have these huge fog bows, which just look fantastic. These are panoramic pictures, so these fog bows are on the opposite side of the sun, but they give the atmosphere on the ice something like a very mystical atmosphere there, beautiful days. The sun goes deeper and deeper, and therefore the melting stops and the freezing of the winter kicks in. Now all the melt ponds on the 10th of September here are covered by ice and snow, and the landscape now again is the deeply frozen landscape that we have seen at the beginning of the expedition. And with that, we have concluded the full one year cycle of the Arctic sea ice. And with that, we have finished our job. And on the 20th of September, actually exactly 1 year after we have set out in Tromsø, we have left our ice floe and went on our way back to Bremerhaven. The 20th of September was at the same time the day when the border of the sun here for the first time touched the horizon. Over the next 36 hours, it will now go below the horizon. That is the single and only sunset you can see at the North Pole within 1 year. It takes 36 hours, but as this sunset was still going on, we decided to sail off because we didn't want to freeze in for a second year, and the ice was getting thicker rapidly now, and we needed to go back. And therefore, nobody so far has ever encountered that single sunset fully at the North Pole. Nobody has been there that late during the season. With that, I want to say thank you to these fantastic teams with which we have worked on the ice, the 5 teams of the MOSAiC expedition. Wonderful people. We have had a very intense time, very intense work on the ice. We also had a lot of fun, a lot of good parties, and I think we have started a few new families during the expedition as well. And I want to thank you for your attention. Thanks. Do you have any immediate questions about the MOSAiC expedition before we go to the panel? Yeah.
First of all, thank you for a very nice presentation, very lively. Second thing, I was wondering, the impact of icebreakers, I guess it's negligible?
Well, no, not really. We have taken much care to understand what our own impact on our environment is, and to make sure we understand which part of our measurements are unaffected by our own impact and which are affected, and to sort them out or to use them as a template for a future world when we have increasing ship traffic through the Arctic and increasing emissions like the one from our icebreaker. So the area close to the vessel, which was polluted by our own emissions, is like a template for the future Arctic, and we are making use of that to understand how the future Arctic may look like. The area upstream from the atmospheric circulation and further away from the vessel is mostly unaffected by the vessel itself.
Okay, and my second question is, do you have to be that many people?
Not at any time. We had 100 people on board at any time during the 5 phases, and we had 450 people on board. Yes, we were more than busy. I think we could have brought back even more science if we had more space on board. So we were very much limited by the number of berths, by the number of people we could take onto the expedition here. And therefore, everybody on board was constantly extremely busy and at the limit of what a single scientist can do on the ice. Because we really had all disciplines of Arctic research on board during the expedition: atmospheric scientists, scientists looking at the ice and snow system, at the ocean, at the ecosystem, and the biogeochemistry. And if you break that down from these 100 people, there are 35 or so crew members to just run the vessel, then 65 people by 5 disciplines. It's not really that many.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up question to that last question? Is this going to be the last expedition of its kind? I mean, to what extent can this be done by autonomous systems in the future? Thank you.
Very good question. The scale of many of these processes in the Arctic is really small. So we look at fluxes of energy and momentum, for example, from the surface of the ice or from leads of open water, which are carried by eddies in the atmosphere, which have scales of just a few meters. It's very hard to measure these things. Certainly not, it's not possible to measure them with remote instruments from space platforms, and it's very hard to do that with autonomous instruments. We have brought back many 10,000 samples from snow, ice, atmosphere, ocean water, ecosystem species, which would be extremely hard to sample, to get from autonomous instruments. We know pretty well what we can do with autonomous instruments because our 50 stations further out on the ice, they were autonomous. But that is very limited, and only those which we could visit regularly during the winter to maintain them and to repair them and to repair the damage from the harsh environmental conditions and from the polar bears, only those survived the drift. There are simple autonomous instruments which can give us the temperature, the wind speed, the sea ice thickness, the temperature in only the uppermost layer of the ocean. But that's it. All the complex stuff, radiation, aerosols, cloud-aerosol interaction between radiation and clouds, interactions between the surfaces and clouds and turbulence. I don't think that any time soon we'll have autonomous instrumentation to do these measurements.
Thank you very much. First of all, for the very nice presentation. I imagine that the results of the research are probably very fine-grained, like there are lots of measurements and lots of data. Could you single out, if we think about the fight against climate change, is there anything that you could single out, or maybe it's too early to say, but is there any interesting tendency in your findings, anything that's surprising or groundbreaking that has come out of this?
Oh, this is no longer working. Anyway, so I do that without a slide. Yeah, there are so many exciting, thrilling results out already now. Most of them are pretty difficult to explain because they go into the details of that complex clockwork of the Arctic climate systems, which of all these processes which affect each other. And just maybe I want to highlight one finding. Since over the past 40 years or so, the sea ice extent in the Arctic in its summer minimum has been reduced by 50%. So it's now only 50% of what it used to be. In former decades, it used to be 8 million square kilometers or so. During the winter of the expedition, during the summer of the expedition, we had less than 4 million square kilometers. And that brings up the question whether the sea ice is on a downward slope and is approaching a tipping point from which on it will disappear even if we limit further warming. Because when the sea ice disappears, the dark ocean surface can take up much more heat than the white ice surface would take up. It would just reflect the heat back into the space. And that could limit freezing during the next winter after a summer with little sea ice. And then with reduced freezing, you would go with less ice into next summer and so on and so on. So it could develop into a vicious circle so that the ice from some point on would disappear without even any further warming. From that, we have very optimistic and good news. For the first time, we were able to study the freezing process and the health of the freezing process during winter. And we have seen it is still very healthy. It offsets much of the disappearance of the ice in summer. 40 meters of the water column below the ice reach the freezing point, minus 1.7 degrees Celsius, the freezing point of salty water, during winter, even nowadays. That is a healthy buffer for increased warming, and the freezing process in winter will remain pretty healthy for some more warming. Putting all that into models and into our understanding of how the sea ice cycle during one full year really develops, we now think there is not such a thing like a tipping point for the Arctic sea ice. It's responding fairly directly and linearly to climate warming. So if we stabilize climate, if we stop warming, then we'll stop the disappearance of the sea ice. And that is good news, because we didn't know whether we would be beyond such a tipping point already now. And we are not there. We can still save the Arctic sea ice. That is good news. Having in mind what the realistic greenhouse gas emission scenarios are, we'll almost certainly see at least occasionally ice-free summers in the Arctic in a couple of decades, around the mid of the century. But with these results, we know that even if we get one sea ice-free summer, that doesn't mean the ice is away and won't come back the next winter and summer. And therefore, there we have good news. We have, for the first time, we have been able to study a unique ecosystem. Just to highlight a second result from a completely different area. An ecosystem that develops at something which is pretty crazy or amazing. When these melt ponds melt through, they are sweet water. They don't contain much salt, these melt ponds. If they melt through, all that sweet water gets below the ice and it forms ponds on the underside of the ice, because it's less dense, and therefore it sits in the orography on the ice surface from below. It's a landscape of ponds of freshwater lenses below the ice. And at the very pronounced boundary layer between the salty water and the freshwater, which you can see when you go with a diving robot through the water, you can see it like a mirror in the water column. At the surface, at the interface, there's a unique ecosystem living, green, brownish stuff, all kinds of plankton species living there. And we were, for the first time, able to study what's going on. And they emit gases which then affect by atmospheric chemistry, cloud properties, and it's all linked to the Arctic climate system. Just two highlights of results.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I would like to invite the panelists now to join me on stage. The discussion for the last part of our evening, please feel free to come up as I introduce. I'll take this chair closest to me, so if everyone can find your way. So just to give a little introduction, when we consider the history of the Arctic, observations of climate change, and current geopolitical pressure, we have to include people living in the Arctic, honoring their indigenous knowledge and perception of current change. We will be discussing now new challenges to the environment in Arctic societies with Markus Rex and Jan Bohm, as well as Gun-Britt Retta, the head of Arctic Environmental Unit of the Sami Council in Norway, and she has worked on issues related to Arctic climate since 2001. And also Professor Rasmus Bertelsen, Professor of Northern Studies and the inaugural Barents Chair in Politics at the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø. Welcome, everyone. So Gun-Britt, I think I will start with you. I am just curious how you are seeing climate change manifest in your area of Norway.
Yeah, well, I live very far northeast in Norway, 70 degrees north. It's, well, we have observed climate change already for decades, but as Sami people, in reindeer husbandry, for example, we are migrating and we depend on change. So we have a knowledge to cope with change. But what I think, and I often say that the greatest challenge maybe with climate change is, maybe surprisingly, the search for alternative or the alternative energy sources, which is a kind of the secondary effect of climate change, that the solutions are as impactful and damaging for our cultures as the climate change in itself. And there's a fragmentation of land and nature destruction happening in the search for green solutions.
And I know we'll continue speaking about this. To continue, Rasmus, I'm curious if you could give us an idea of what you think, how has the world changed since February 2022, and specifically the Arctic?
Well, of course, we have the horrible war in Ukraine with the incredible loss of life, material destruction, which also destroys European order, and it destroys Arctic order. And the Arctic, as we have talked about, there are two common discourses about the Arctic, which I think we should be critical about. One is the Arctic exceptionalism, and the other one is recent interest in the Arctic. I think there's a very long-standing international interest in the Arctic, and the Arctic exceptionalism. I would say that the Arctic often reflects international politics quite closely. We saw that during the Cold War, we saw that after the Cold War, and now, of course, the international order we've had since the end of the Cold War is coming to an end. We see that in the Sino-American relationship, we see that in the Russian-American relationship, and that is also affecting the Arctic very much. We've seen that in Sino-American relations, and we see that very abruptly now concerning circumpolar cooperation, where of course Russia is roughly half of the Arctic, and the circumpolar cooperation that was possible after the end of the Cold War, well, that circumpolar cooperation is of course now largely disrupted.
And we, of course, will continue this thread as we speak. To just jump in with you, Jan, considering Mallory's life, engagement, and advocacy for the North, what do you think we can learn from him today regarding these challenges in the Arctic?
I think we can learn a lot from him, from the Inuit through him, as it were, and the other indigenous peoples he has been studying, because one of the sentences he always likes to use is, I went to Inuit school. He said, these were my real masters. This is where I discovered my own personality, and I understood that there's more to life than just what we're being taught at school in our countries. So that is an important message, and through this there comes a second message that contrary to what people usually think, and what we've just seen here, but that's normal because he went to those places. The Arctic is not empty, because this is a very common way of speaking about the Arctic as an empty place. That's how many people here in Central Europe like to see it and dream about, this is a place where I can get away from people and society, as it were, which was probably true in your case, even though you had a micro-society on the ship. But, you know, we mentioned Tromsø, which is a big city. You have many places where you have a lot of people, and it is always important to remember that there is not only the scientific work, but it is done in an area where there are people living, experiencing things, and so we should take an interest in that, and we should take an interest in the emotion of these people, and our own emotion. He has always insisted on that in his writing. He has this artistic dimension, as you could see from the artwork that he does himself. So he thinks in science we should not forget the emotion, and you spent quite a lot of time talking about the aesthetics of what you were seeing. That's very, very important, because that's how we usually experience the world, rather than through statistics and graphs. So I think that's a really important message here. And there's maybe one more point, excuse me, the other issue that is important is that we should always think in circumpolar ways, that the Arctic is a big region and people are having similar experiences. So what Rasmus was just saying about what's going on with Russia is, of course, a tragedy, because that concerns about half of the surface we're talking about.
Yes, and Marcus, what do you think are the biggest challenges in the Arctic right now?
For Arctic research, of course, it is the loss of our ability to collaborate with all the Arctic states. And And if you look at the map, you mentioned that Russia is a pretty significant part of the Arctic. An expedition like MOSAiC cannot take place without collaboration with many countries, but also with including Russia. In a world like today, it would no longer be possible, and that is a tragedy. Of course, the war is a tragedy on so many levels that the other levels are certainly much more important even. But it's also a tragedy for research and our ability to understand the Arctic and our ability to protect the Arctic, because it will become more accessible for economical development in the future, and that needs a regulatory framework. And the Arctic Circle, the panel of the Arctic states, which has to set up, it's the only body which can set up international regulations for protecting the Arctic and to make sure that the development will take place in a sustainable way, has lost one of its important members. It's obviously still a member of the Arctic Circle, but it has lost its ability to negotiate across all the member states. And that is another dimension of tragedy.
Do you think science could be a bridge or act more in the way of diplomacy regarding these challenges in the Arctic? For Marcus or for anyone who would like to answer.
Well, because I have a role as in international relations at my university, I will answer that question. I think we just had a group of people, colleagues from the Ukraine, so I think that the effort has to go there right now. And as far as the relations with the Russian Federation are concerned, there's no institutional cooperation between French institutions and Russian institutions right now, even though we're trying to keep contacts at a personal level. But that's the situation. Now my distinguished neighbor and Gunrit also participated in a highbrow event in Monaco earlier this year, where you had some of the leading scientists in the world talking about climate change. You understood that's the number one topic that everybody should be concerned about, nothing else, you know. And then the news arrived of this war, and it became absolutely clear that things are going the wrong way. So we have a problem. We have to reinvent international circumpolar cooperation now, because the cooperation with Russia, as the term says in the Arctic, is paused. It's not ended forever, of course, but it is paused, and it is a serious issue. Thinking of permafrost studies, for instance. Yeah.
Yes, I think the Arctic Council started as immediately after the end of the Cold War, and science, it's kind of a three-party partnership, because science is one of the key factors in the Arctic Council, which is gathered or collected in assessments through the Arctic Council working groups. So science was, I would say, one of the first things that we started to do after the end of the Cold War, and the indigenous peoples was also ready to sit at the same table, or negotiated a seat at the same table in the Arctic Council as permanent participants, and you had the 8 Arctic states. So, and now this cooperation is on pause, and I'm not the one to answer how we should get this pause to end, but I think one of the answers to end this is science, maybe, and how, because that is the important thing, and you have a big hole if you don't have Russia included. But also, of course, Arctic Council is a very important arena for indigenous peoples, Arctic indigenous peoples, as that is the arena where we have a seat at the table. So for us also, this would be very important to get working again, because we have this strong recognition in this. And also, if I may add to that point, that I have 20 years of experience in this cooperation, and the indigenous peoples have a much stronger informal role and position in the council than formal role. And in geopolitical tensions, which we have experienced now, we realized how vulnerable informal position is, because we haven't been very strongly included in discussions during the pause, which is also a concern. And now Rasmus has all the answers.
No, I don't have any answers in this absolutely horrible situation. I just wanted to add to the natural sciences perspective that from a social sciences perspective and humanities perspective, so I'm a professor of political science, I do think we should think carefully about the value also of exchanges in the, for example, my area of political science, international relations. We very often hear the example of the importance of the natural sciences exchanges, for example, for the question of climate change. Perhaps biodiversity could be another topic. But in my area, international relations, where there's often a tie between fundamental research and the application, the policy, the strategy, there the academic exchange, it does serve as a window into how the other side sees things and what is the thinking of the other side. I think we should be very careful about not confusing understanding with sympathy, that understanding in a purely intellectual way, understanding an opponent's perspective, we should not confuse that with sympathizing. And I think we should think carefully about what the possible costs are of having a reduced insight into how the other side is thinking and seeing things. Thank you.
I was wanting to follow up with Gun-Britt. You've been working with indigenous Arctic organizations. You're researching some of the history of how these organizations came to be, and you did meet Jean Mallory at one point. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it was fascinating, and I was also a bit surprised to. Well, one is that I met Jean Mallory in person in 2009, but I met him in this history of that I was looking into, as next year will be the 50 years anniversary of Arctic Peoples Conference that took place in Copenhagen in November 1973. We are, by the way, fundraising for that event also. But when I was looking into how did these Inuit from Greenland and Sami and First Nation representatives from Canada get the idea of getting together? And then I learned that Jean Mallory was in charge, or I don't know exactly who was planning, but there was an Arctic Oil and Gas Conference in Le Havre in May 1973, which gathered at least 7 indigenous representatives, 4 of them from Greenland and 3 of them from Canada. And they were so happy to meet, and because they were trying to raise their concerns about land rights and their territories and this oil and gas extraction. And they very soon came to the conclusion that they need to have a separate meeting. So they decided, let's have a meeting. And only 5-6 months later, they managed to meet, and there were 21 organizations. I don't remember exactly the number of representatives that met in Christiansborg in Copenhagen in 1973. And so I think in that sense, Jean Mallory was a bit instrumental in bringing some of these together so they could get this idea of making this circumpolar gathering. And that's also why I think the indigenous peoples were so ready when the Arctic states started to talk about meeting or making an Arctic environmental protection strategy. The indigenous peoples already had their declarations. They had met 15 years earlier and kept meeting. So they were very quick now knocking on the doors and saying, hey, you're talking about our territories again. We need to be at the table. But it was also, I have to add, very fascinating to meet Jean Mallory in 2009, and then hearing again the messages that he shared also in that speech that he held there that I had to read this morning, and calling for that the voices of the people in the Arctic have to be heard and should not be left out. And he was calling for multidisciplinary research and culturalism. And he was speaking very clearly against war and talking for peace in 2009.
Did you want to add something, Jan?
Well, I could add that, as I mentioned before, that from 57 he was invited to Leningrad to the Arctic Institute, and his director at the time, Fernand Braudel, who's another famous French historian, said, "Go for it, because it's very important to keep contacts, even in those difficult times then." And so he was going regularly. Of course, he was not allowed to go to Chukotka, it was simply out of bounds. But when in 1990 President Gorbachev had made his famous speech in Murmansk to open the Arctic to research, he was first on the list to be able to go. So it was a long time in the making, as it were, you know. And so from that point of view, it paid, as it were, to keep contacts, you know. But this concern for indigenous people of the Arctic to get together and to be heard is absolutely central in his work. He has always been defending that. And when we were talking to Monaco about the setting up of the institute, they wanted to know, so what is really central for him? And he's always said, defense of the indigenous people. That's the central issue.
Yeah, I was going to follow up with what are some of the issues you find when scientists drop into the Arctic to do research without collaborating or being in touch with local populations?
Yeah, first of all, there's no indigenous peoples far out on the ice where the polar stem went. So I don't know if there were indigenous peoples on board. But yes, in Sami community, we are also discussing this, the importance of having indigenous peoples, and in my case, Sami people, part of the discussions on, in particular, social sciences, but also natural science, because we live there all year round and are observers depending on the ecosystems and the nature. So I think, and we see that development more and more to this co-creation or co-production of knowledge, where one is that indigenous, or the indigenous knowledge held by indigenous peoples, or traditional knowledge that some people call it, is important, but also that we are part of defining the science needs, not only through our indigenous knowledge, but also I think a lot of indigenous peoples and others have experienced scientists coming in with a predefined question that local people find, well, why are you researching that? We already know the answers to that, so you can just tell you. But you should rather look at something else, like I can have a list of things to look at, but I think that is important. But also it becomes, now we have a kind of succeeded in defining that you need to engage with indigenous peoples. We also see a rush to the Arctic with scientists, and you can also get into what we call it, knowledge, what do you call it? I lost the English word, but extraction, where you kind of just come and pick the knowledge and don't return it back to the society so they can address their needs based on the knowledge that they have found. So we need both to be part of defining the needs, but also part in finding the solutions or implementing the solutions after. And yeah, also ethics is something we work on.
Yes, Rasmus.
Yeah, just to follow up on what Gunbrit was talking about, I think it's very important to have strong institutions in the Arctic. So my day job is the Arctic University of Norway in Tromsø, and with campuses throughout northern Norway. And of course, there's the Sami University College in Kautokeino. This year and next year, I have the Nansen Visiting Professorship at Akureyri University in northern Iceland. And having very good academic institutions in the north, I think that is key for both the local communities, the indigenous communities, to be part of this knowledge building exercise, and to have very strong circulation with the outside world. I'm a host to some of Jan's PhD students visiting in Tromsø. I'd very much like young Scandinavians to be much more adventurous going out, but I just wanted to add the importance of the northern institutions. Thank you.
So are there any good examples of cooperation between researchers and local communities
Well, yeah, one which is natural to share to this audience is the Davigi project, which is a cooperation between my organization, Sami Council, and the German institutions, which I should remember the name of several, and which is exactly about creating arenas on how to define those questions and have platforms to discuss the needs and so on. So we have several of these initiatives where we are testing the co-production and co-create methodologies so we can learn in the future. And I totally agree with what Rasmus was saying too, that we need these institutions in the north because we can't depend on individuals. We can't send individuals out there. They need to have an institution behind them, supporting them in being partners in science and research cooperation.
Maybe from perspective of exploration, even if you look at history, just look at which of these explorers have been successful and which haven't. Scott and Franklin, and even to a large extent Shackleton, have not been successful. The explorers who lived with the indigenous populations, with the Inuit in many cases, Nansen, Amundsen and Mallory, they have been successful because they have learned how to live and work and survive in those areas. And I think that is still valid. What we now, even on the MOSAiC expedition, are using, we call it the Nansen sled, which actually is the wrong name. It should be the Inuit sled because Nansen got that concept from the Inuit, and he has lived with the Inuit and he learned how to build these sledges. I think that's another example that it is just silly and not very efficient to do research and science in the Arctic without involving the indigenous knowledge.
Absolutely. To add another thing, as far as institutions are concerned, we have those that you mentioned, and we have also a fantastic network called the University of the Arctic, with over 200 members, our universities and associate members. President Bui mentioned that is an absolutely wonderful way to bring people together, and indigenous communities play a central role in EU Arctic. So on the institutional side, we do have institutions, but they need to receive more support. From the European point of view, I don't know if everyone knows, usually now when you have a call for a big research project concerning the Arctic, there is mandatory indigenous participation. As long as you have one or two, right? So it's sometimes a little bit, if you allow me, like positive discrimination in a way, you know. So, but in other cases, we have interesting co-creation at our university. We managed to welcome a Siberian Evenki, Rinde Herder, as an associate researcher, which is unique in France. And he just defended his master's degree, actually, on professional experience. But what I also would like to mention this round is that we have a lot of enthusiasm from the outside for the Arctic, which is very good. But you have to be organized about what you're doing. So in Greenland right now, for instance, we have phenomena like we have over-tourism, 6,000 people going in one day to Ilulissat, to a community of 2,000 to 3,000 people just watching the icebergs. And we have over-researching. There are places in Greenland where you have, at the same time, several social science teams, you know, and then people are getting fed up and saying, we can't answer these questions all day, you know, we have to get on with life, you know. I mean, it's so serious that now the University of Greenland is organized, setting up an ethics committee, and they want to publish really substantial guidelines, ethical guidelines on how to do research, and they're even thinking of setting up a committee, a bit like in Nunavut. Nunavut, you cannot go just now anymore to do research. You have to have authorization from the municipalities because it was getting out of hand. And people were fed up of people coming with research questions that were not relevant from their point of view, or approaches that are not, as they say in Alaska, culturally relevant to the people who are there. No.
That is a good lead into the question I had for you, actually, Jan. Speaking of the German-French cooperation, I was wondering where you see there could be more improvements in the international qualification and educational system.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a natural thing to preach for your own chapel, we say in French. So my banner is I'm your Arctic Humanities Chair, and I think we have a lot of natural science research, fantastic. We have a lot of social science research, fantastic. But we're not so well organized about letting in the human sciences, literature, history, culture. Even though this is an absolutely important aspect of research. I wanted to talk about a fantastic book, an autobiography by an Arctic leader called Sheila Watt-Cloutier. She's written a book called The Right to be Cold, so she's been defending the fact that there is a cultural side to the climate change that people are not so often talking about. They see it as a natural science problem and phenomenon, but there's a cultural side to it because it's destroying the livelihoods of many people in the natural space. If you cannot enjoy the conditions that you're used to in your own environment, you're not happy. So why people should be happy about it in the Arctic? And this is something that's too often neglected. So institutional cooperation can do a lot, of course, as long as it covers the field, as it were. And another dimension that is often absent, but I think it's a phenomenon of our society today. So we're obsessed with our own contemporary society, and we tend to forget what French people call the spirit of history or sense for history, that the problems have been there for a long, long time, and if people are acting in a certain way, that's because they've been around for a long time. They're used and fed up with people coming all the time and with their own point of view, so I think we need to focus on that again more. There's a long history to all that. Yes, we can do a lot in cooperation at this level.
This is a question for everyone. In worrying about accessibility to the Arctic, I was curious what everyone thinks should be done or could be done to ensure research can continue while still protecting the environment that you are trying to study.
First, we need to learn what our impact is to limit it. And therefore, for example, in the MOSAiC expedition, we have a pretty significant group of people working on understanding what our impact was, and also working on solutions to reduce that impact in future expeditions. I think that is something that will become more and more important in the future, that we really have to also make sure we minimize what we do to the environment while we research it, and particularly in those fragile and remote areas like the Arctic. Of course, traveling with the ice, with the main engines shut off, is a much more sustainable way of doing research in the Arctic than using the full power of all engines on board to ram and break through the ice with the largest consumption of energy and fuel that you can ever have on a vessel, on one of the icebreakers in a ramming track through the ice. Taking these elements into account in designing and planning expeditions and fieldwork, I think has not been really a major driving factor in the past, but has to be one in the future.
Any other thoughts from?
Oh, that's a valid remark for all research. I mean, we have in the international academia huge meetings every year where hundreds of people travel very far to some place to present something for 10 minutes. We need to rethink about that, if that's really reasonable. Just like we need to think about our mobility in Europe. We're involved in a number of student mobility projects now, reflecting on how we can reduce the carbon footprint of student mobility while maintaining a high level of exchange. So I think all of us are concerned by these issues. And,
two quick points. One following up on actually the last question and what Jan was talking about. I mean, I do think we have many good opportunities for exchange, circulation, etc. Of course, between the Nordic countries, we have Nordplus program, European countries, Erasmus. And in both Tromsø and Akureyri, we have very popular destinations of European students, and what is a problem for us is that Nordic students are much less likely to go out than European students are coming to us. I personally think that's because I don't think Nordic labor markets value outside experience, so that responsibility rests with employers. So we have great opportunity. I mean, I enjoy very much teaching students from all over Europe coming to Tromsø, and I wish our students would go out and share their experiences and perspectives. The last question, which of course in social sciences and humanities, well, I thought about twisting it a little bit, and that is something which of great concern to me, and that is the future of both research and student exchange in a world more and more characterized by the conflict with China, conflict with Russia. And of course, I'm sure everybody here is aware of this very unfortunate incident where my university in Tromsø seems to have played host to a Russian intelligence officer. There are so many instructions and documents coming from above, from various security services about all kinds of concerns and limitations exchanging, working with the other side. I've had the privilege of having a good deal of academic cooperation, both with China and Russia, other countries. And I think we should keep a very cool head and think very carefully to maintain these kinds of exchanges, despite whatever risks may be associated with that. So there was a twist on the sustainability and impact. Thank you.
And thank you. I realize we're coming up on towards the end of the time that we have today. So I was wondering if there are any questions from the audience that we could answer while we have all of these experts on stage. Raise a hand if you'd like to ask a question. In the meantime, I'd love to know from each of you, what do you hope for the Arctic in 2023? Only the coming year. Oh yes, the next year or the next 10 years, the next 100 years.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Sure.
Yeah, I was surprised because I had prepared for 20 and 100 years perspective.
Sure, sorry.
No, one is that for next year, of course, I hope that the Arctic Council will be operational again and that we get a successful, that's one, and the other for next year is that we get a successful celebration of 50 years of this Arctic indigenous cooperation. But also I'm sometimes playing with this thought of the Arctic that I grew up in 70s and 80s on the near 70 kilometers from the Russian border, 40 kilometers from the Finnish border, but I live on the Norwegian side, where if the warming keeps on in the pace like now, we will not recognize, we wouldn't have the indicator. And and reindeer is kind of, it's not the only livelihood of Sami people, but it's a very strong cultural carrier of Sami culture. It's a species that lives in areas that have snow parts of the year. What if we have very little snow? I think there will be competitors to the reindeer, and we need to manage it very strongly if we are keeping reindeer husbandry. So that is the concern, of course, to a vision of a very few snow days also in the Arctic region where I belong. But that's not next year.
You have already made the point about the Arctic Council, that we move back to a state where the Arctic states can negotiate the things that need to be negotiated, because the Arctic warming is not going to wait for us humans to sort out our issues. I just want to take it to the global scale. I hope for the Arctic that during next year we'll slowly start to move back into international collaboration and cooperation on this planet. Unfortunately, over the past 10 years or so, we have seen the opposite development. We have seen the increasing national interests in international negotiations. We have seen that many states have moved away from multilateralism, have moved further to the side of nationalism. And that is bad news, because we can only solve the big global problems like protecting our climate, which is in itself protecting our Arctic, in international collaboration. And therefore, what holds for the Arctic Council also holds for the rest of the planet. We need to move back to international collaboration. Therefore, COP27 was very disappointing compared to COP26, which took place in a different world.
I would just say a very simple thing. I would plead for peace and responsible prosperity in the Arctic, and that Arctic indigenous peoples continue to make us change our way in which we see the world. I think we need that.
Unfortunately, I'm very pessimistic for Circumpolar Arctic Cooperation, because I think the Circumpolar Arctic Cooperation we had the last 25, 30 years, it rested on an international order, which in political science language you could call it American unipolarity and hegemony, that the United States was the undisputed single superpower. And my view would be that the international order basis for that kind of Arctic cooperation no longer exists. So we're going to get some kind of Arctic order, but it's not going to be what we had the last 30 years.
Is there any questions from the audience yet? Yes.
Yeah, thank you very much for this discussion and this very insightful exchange of ideas. I had a question about the Arctic political order that you just mentioned. Earlier, you said that Arctic expressionism was coming to its end. I was wondering about your ideas for the future of the Arctic Council, for instance, and what we could see coming next year when Russia's chairmanship will eventually end. Will we see the work of the Arctic Council resume, or will we see, on the contrary, the emergence of a parallel governance body with Russia heading it and other non-Arctic powers joining them, as they wished for some years now? They expressed the wish of seeing another governance body that would be more inclusive for non-Arctic powers and their interest in the region. My second question is a more optimistic one. It concerns the day when the war will be finally over. As Jean Mallory was one of the first international scholars to visit post-Soviet Russia, what can we learn from, well, the way he showed that cooperation was still possible even after war and threats and very dark times? Thank you very much.
Yeah, Jan, perhaps you would like to take the Mallory part.
Well, in his case, it worked out, but right now, of course, we have instructions, as it were, right? So we are keeping to that, and of course, we hope that the cooperation will be possible again, but it's not obvious at all, is it? Once we get out of this tragic situation, I don't think we can go back to business as usual, as it were. It's not going to be easy. I think we have to try, but the situation will be different, I think.
Quick follow-up to what Jan was just saying. I mean, these days, one thing I think about is that I don't think we realize how incredibly lucky we were at the end of the Cold War. We had a nuclear superpower, the Soviet Union, dissolving basically only at internal cost. Of course, very significant internal social, economic, public health, etc. cost, with maybe 20,000 nuclear warheads, with I don't think a single one going unaccounted for. And I think about the importance of individuals like, of course, Mikhail Gorbachev, but also Bush the Elder and Helmut Kohl in this country. And you look around, I don't see those kinds of leaders on either side today. The question about the future Arctic order, I think it's very clear, and I was thinking about this also before this war, that I was expecting on theoretical grounds, how to say, a much more bipolar order, a Western Arctic and a Russian Arctic. I thought it was going to be driven much more by the Sino-American competition, and then we have this European war. I think it's very clear that this circumpolar cooperation in these areas of environment, science, indigenous questions, sustainable development, I don't see that coming back. And also, I mean, of course, on the Western side, we'll have to decide to what extent we want access to Russian Arctic, Russian science, etc., etc. That's for us to decide. And another question is that, as I sometimes joke to students about, Russia's got more Arctic than it knows what to do about. I mean, maybe that circumpolar Arctic cooperation is not, maybe it's not very valuable. Maybe it's not very interesting for Russia. And of course, as you allude to, there are big Asian countries, Asian economies, that have significant interest, especially in Russian energy resources. So I think the future is, it's a bipolar Arctic, as we saw during the Cold War, but of course a bipolar Arctic in a globalized world where Asia takes up a completely different place in the world economy than during the Cold War. Thank you.
Well, I believe we could probably keep on talking all evening. And you're welcome to join us in the foyer for refreshments and continue chatting with the panelists. For now, this is all the time we have on stage. Thank you so much to all of the panelists for being with us today. We'd also like to thank the French Embassy, UVSQ, the Alfred Wegener Institute, and Reclam for putting together the event. And yes, thank you for joining us this evening. Please enjoy the drinks and snacks in the foyer. And thank you again for coming out this evening.
That was really interesting. Yeah. I'm really optimistic.